Hello, this is Writing the High Places. I'm Scott Stenson. Welcome to my channel. This channel is dedicated to deepening and expanding our understanding of the Holy Scriptures, as well as the prophets, the writings of the prophets, and the teachings of the prophets, ancient and modern. Good to be with you. In recent days, there's been a lot of traffic, of course, on social media relative to the upcoming election. Today, I wanted to not so much get into my views about that as talk about, there's an interesting set of issues found in the Book of Mormon that I think are relevant. And I wanted to talk about Joseph Smith's views of the Constitution and the White Horse prophecy a bit as well. And so let me begin with the Book of Mormon, a prophecy that's familiar to those who have read the Book of Mormon. It's consistent with earlier teachings by Lehi and others. Now, in the Book of Ether, this is abridged. This book's abridged by Moroni, and Moroni gives us here. He's speaking now to the Latter-day Gentiles when he speaks of the covenants associated, the decrees of God, he says, associated with the land. And so this is, I'm going to read Ether 2, 7 to 12. And just kind of touch on a few things and then raise a question or two about it, okay? Because it's not immediately obvious exactly how we're to understand this or how exactly Latter-day Saints are to understand this. Verse 7 says, "And the Lord would not suffer that they should stop beyond the sea in the wilderness," meaning the Jaredites, "but he would that they should come forth even unto the land of promise," so the Western Hemisphere, "which was choice above all other lands." Okay, so lands being choice above other lands, which the Lord God had preserved for a righteous people. So the Lord leads his righteous people or his righteous children into precious lands and choice lands. Verse 8, "And he had sworn, God had sworn in his wrath unto the brother of Jared, that whoso should possess this land of promise, from that time henceforth and forever should serve him, the true and only God, or they should be swept off when the fullness of his wrath should come upon them." Okay, did you catch that decree of God? That this land that was precious and choice, that those who abide here should serve the true and only God. We learn later that true and only God's name is Jesus Christ. And when they would fall into transgression, they would be swept from the land by the wrath of God. Verse 9 says, "And now we can behold the decrees of God concerning this land, that it is a land of promise." This is Moroni speaking again. "And whatsoever nation shall possess it shall serve God, or they shall be swept off when the fullness of his wrath shall come upon them. And the fullness of his wrath cometh upon them when they are ripened in iniquity. For behold, this is a land," Moroni says, or this land rather, "is choice above all other lands. Wherefore he that doth possess it shall serve God." There's that phrase again. "They shall serve God, or shall be swept off. For it is the everlasting decree of God, and it is not until the fullness of iniquity cometh among the children of the men children of men upon the land that they are swept off." And verse 11 says, "And this cometh unto you, O ye Gentiles," Moroni speaking directly to the Latter-day Gentiles. "This comes to you, O ye Gentiles, that ye may know the decrees of God, that ye may repent, and not continue in your iniquities until the fullness come, that ye may not be brought down, that ye may not bring down the fullness of the wrath of God upon you, as the inhabitants of the land have hitherto done," meaning the Jaredites and the Nephites. "Behold, this is a choice land," he reiterates, "and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall be free from bondage, and from captivity, and from all other nations under heaven." This sounds very much like the former promises made to Lehi, of course. The Lord made a similar covenant with Lehi. And he speaks about those in chapter 1 of 2nd Nephi. "And if they will but serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ, who hath been manifested by the things which we have written, they shall be spared these things." the wrath of God, and so forth. So these are the decrees of God upon the land, that the people are to serve God and not enter into iniquity and transgression. And should they do so, they would be swept off by the wrath of God in due time. This is also the same teaching of Mosiah 29, that when the people would begin to choose iniquity instead of that which is right, then the judgments of God would be manifest in their lives. Now, why do I bring this up? Because, again, this isn't entirely clear. It sounds as if the passage in Moroni, he's speaking of the Western Hemisphere. Again, we don't have too many specifics as to the geography. But it sounds as if Moroni is speaking to the Latter-day Gentiles dwelling in the Western Hemisphere, that they are upon choice land, and the decrees of God are pretty specific as to they're to serve God and so forth. Now, but how does this relate? Here's my question. How does this relate to constitutional government? Okay, because we also learn in the Revelations that, and this is true of Mosiah's government earlier, that Mosiah had established a system whereby the voice of the people was the great principle. In fact, in Mosiah 29, he says, you are to do your business by the voice of the people. And that no one would there's no punishment for a person because of his beliefs. In other words, it wasn't unless they broke the laws of the land that they were punished. And the rule of law did hold with them. In fact, it's a very important principle as depicted in the Book of Mormon, the rule of law. But what does it mean that this nation, so long as they serve God, would be spared the judgments of God? And what does it mean that in this land there would be freedom, and in this land that those who that there would be freedom, and that there would be that there would be freedom of conscience and the ability to believe as one pleases. So keep in mind Joseph Smith's teachings, Article of Faith number 11. But this principle is all over the Book of Mormon as well. The idea that there was no binding of the conscience of men. Okay, in other words, they weren't punished for their beliefs. They were punished if they broke the laws of the land. And so there's kind of a paradox here, because it sounds as if those who come here must serve Jesus Christ, or and there's no alternative. But this is why I raised the question, because we live in a constitutional republic, and there is no one religion, and in fact many people do not have a religious faith, and yet try to live decent lives. And so there's this dilemma. Now let me go into Joseph Smith's statements, some of his statements about the Constitution. He said the Constitution of the United States, he was an enthusiast about it. He said it's a glorious standard. And we learn in the Revelations that it promotes just and holy principles, and that it makes, in section 101 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it indicates that the Constitution has been set up by men raised up to that purpose, wise men raised up to that purpose, that moral agency might be allowed to operate as to futurity, meaning that every person ought to be able to act, and this is consistent with Mosiah's teachings in Mosiah 29, every person ought to be able to act as to futurity in principle, or in doctrine and in principle, with his or her own views as to the future. And the Constitution preserves the freedom of to choose and to act according to doctrine and principle relative to futurity as the person understands it. In other words, there's no one doctrine that's to prevail in the Constitution, in a constitutional republic. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was reading the Constitution the other day, and we have the First Amendment, which of course talks about the idea that no one religion should be established. And then later in the Constitution, it talks about there's no test for office as to a person's religious persuasion. There are other parameters for holding office, not all of which necessarily are inspired. But the thing is, there should be no test for office having to do with the religion of a person. That's stated towards the end of the Constitution proper. And in the amendments, the First Amendment, this idea of freedom of religion, or the idea that no one religion should be established, and the idea is we should be free to worship the God whom we deem appropriate to worship. So Joseph Smith's language comes in handy here. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. So how do these principles, these constitutional principles, correlate, or can they be reconciled with Moroni's very direct statements relative to serving the God of this land? I don't know that I have the answer, but I have my own personal view is that Moroni is speaking. He's speaking in a general sense, so that he's suggesting that all of us live according to the light we possess. And so those who are Christian, those who have Christian doctrine, should abide by that light and attempt to keep the commandments and serve their God, who is Jesus Christ, who is also identified in the passage as the God of the land. And that all of those who don't, maybe they believe in other gods, such as the Muslims, or the Hindus, or the Jews or something. They need to live by the light they possess. And so in this sense, this general sense, I believe Moroni is speaking about the preservation of the land and the preservation of the freedoms of the people, so long as they serve Jesus Christ. And remember, all good comes from Jesus Christ. So if they just simply abide by the light of Christ, the light that Christ has given them, whatever degree of light that is, and whatever doctrinal manifestation that takes, in other words, as long as they're living by the light they possess, then they are in some sense serving the God of the land. Now, of course, in this land, or in this hemisphere, there are people who are called the covenant people of God, the Latter-day Saints. And of course, they possess, these principles are important to them, and they need to serve the God of the land according to their understanding as well, as do all religious sects. Serve their God, the gods that they worship, to the best of their ability, and live by the laws of the light that they do possess. And that's my understanding of how to reconcile this. So we live in a constitutional government, and we're in a pluralistic society. There's a lot of different ways to see, some believe, some are believers, some are not believers. Some are Jewish, some are Hindu, some are Muslim, some have, they're agnostic or atheistic. Yet they live decent lives and or abide by some measure of light, and they try to be respectful and they try to be decent human beings. And so I think we need to take these decrees of God relative to Ether 2 and other places in the Book of Mormon, and not make them become too what is the word I'm looking for? Too narrow-minded about how we understand these things. Because again, it was never intended that we live in this nation and that we all shared the same doctrine, that we all shared the same belief system. In fact, the great principle for us is freedom of conscience. And God would have it, or I believe he would have it no other way. And Joseph Smith often taught that, and so forth. Now, that's one issue. But as I said, Joseph Smith had a high estimation. We have several revelations that directly refer to the Constitution of the United States, and do so in, glowing terms. Now, it's not a perfect document. It is a living and evolving document. We've learned that from our leaders over the years as Latter-day Saints. But the Constitution is inspired, and its founders were wise and raised up to that purpose. It contains just and holy principles. Now, I wanted to share as to what I was saying about a constitutional republic and how that ought to be conceived, Joseph Smith, he taught this idea here, and I'll share this from the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith in this particular version of them. It says here, one statement by Joseph Smith is, "Your Constitution guarantees to every citizen, even the humblest, the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property. It promises to all religious freedom." Okay, so that's a fundamental principle of constitutional government, religious freedom. We don't have to belong to the same religion. Now, we proselyte, we attempt to make converts and so forth, but we believe in that there ought to be plurality of religion, that a man's entitled to worship how, where, or what he may. And he says here that the Constitution promises to all religious freedom, the right to all to worship God beneath their own vine and fig tree, according to the dictates of their conscience. It guarantees to all the citizens of the several states the right to become citizens of any one of the states, one of the states, and to enjoy all the rights and immunities of the citizens of the state of his adoption. Okay, so I love that imagery that, in this land, it ought to be true because we live in a constitutionally protected land where freedom of religion is protected, and it's protected directly in the Constitution itself, but also in the amendments that are in the First Amendment and perhaps elsewhere. The idea of let every person sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, according to the dictates of their own conscience. And Joseph Smith, he said on more than one occasion, I believe, that he was willing to defend the rights of anyone else to have their own religion. He would lay down his life for the benefit of others because, it's that same principle by which he wanted to enjoy freedom of conscience. And of course, the Latter-day Saints were never, back in the 19th century, were not allowed to enjoy religious freedom because their neighbors, couldn't get their heads around this idea that the Latter-day Saints were entitled to serve God according to the dictates of their own conscience. Instead, they thought they had to somehow persecute the saints, drive them out of their communities, and there was no one to protect the saints. In fact, that's why Joseph Smith taught, and I think this is an interesting principle, and maybe I'll share it from his teachings. But he thought the Constitution was inspired, it was a glorious standard, yes, but he also taught the idea that the Constitution had one flaw, at least one flaw, and that flaw was that it was not broad enough to cover the whole ground. It was not broad enough to cover the whole ground. And what did he mean by that? Well, he meant that the Constitution, decreed rights, established the government and gave rights to the people, but yet was not able to enforce those rights and to hold leaders to account who did not uphold those constitutional principles. That's where it wasn't sufficiently broad and encompassing. In fact, this might be surprising to you. I wonder if I have it nearby here. Joseph Smith proposed the idea. I don't see my book nearby here. Joseph Smith proposed the idea that, and this is very consistent with the Book of Mormon, that those leaders who did not uphold the principles of the Constitution that they had taken an oath to serve, that they ought to face capital punishment. And Joseph, by the way, Joseph takes this because he talked to me. He often taught the idea of redress of grievances to this, which is a constitutional principle. This idea of taking your grievances to, trying to work through the channels of law to find relief. So if you're a minority, a weak minority, and you're unable to protect yourself from those who would come against you and strip away from you your rights and your privileges to worship God how you want to, then if you're in that position, you need to be able to lean on those who've taken an oath to uphold the constitutional principles. And Joseph Smith said, and those who don't ought to face the idea of not only due process but capital punishment. Now, he had experience with this. He would approach a leader, and the leader would say, "Your cause is just, but I can't do anything for you because the mobocracy is going to rule, or you're a good man, but there's just too much opposition here. I'm not going to deal with it." Joseph was so frustrated, and finally he ran for office himself, because he understood these principles, that the Constitution needs to be, it's a way of protecting everyone in their rights, whether they're weak or whether they're powerful. And those who are powerful don't necessarily need the same protection, but those who are most vulnerable, like the early Latter-day Saints, they were, being kicked around for their religious beliefs. And Joseph wanted someone in leadership who had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. Of course, the Constitution didn't necessarily provide for this, though. That's why he says there's one flaw in the Constitution, and that is it didn't go far enough in terms of giving power to our leaders to enforce the laws pertaining to constitutional principles and privileges. And it didn't go as far as to say what would be the punishments involved for leaders who did not uphold these principles. And so Joseph Smith, he was willing to defend others' rights and privileges, but he himself, leaders often, more than once, would, send him away without necessarily providing relief or protection, because they themselves, the majorities were kind of acting against the vulnerable minority in the case of the Latter-day Saints. And so among, in our day, Latter-day Saints should be very sensitive to these principles, because yes, we're to serve the God of the land, yes, but importantly, we're also to defend the rights of the most vulnerable among us, and to always be an advocate for the Constitution and for its principles, which protect and allow for. In fact, Joseph Smith compared the Constitution to a great tree providing shade, or a great rock providing refuge for the most vulnerable. This is why government was established by God in the beginning, so that the relationships between men could be regulated, because oftentimes, those who have the strength, they dominate the others. But when there's a rule of law, when there's government, good government, and most governments have, been inspired by God initially, at least, laws that protect, and that are just and right, they tend to safeguard the oppressed and the disenfranchised, and they tend to hold to account those who really should be their protectors and those who should know better, or the majorities that tend to beat with a stick those that they have more power than, which is a huge problem across history. And so, yes, the Constitution, we live in a constitutional republic which is inspired of God, and yet we also understand we're to serve God and to not enter and fall into transgression, that we might not be swept off of the land. These two things, I think, are not incompatible if we just understand these things in this particular way. I wish I had my my statement here about the Constitution doesn't go far enough. Anyway, it's in my teachings. I do have that in my office here. Now, I'll skip number 4 here, item 4, and just get to the white horse prophecy. There's a lot I want to talk about. I've been studying, I've got all these books coming in the mail today. I'm really interested in what's becoming a problem in America, which is this idea of extremism. A lot of the critics of the Book of Mormon, they think it feels too much like a 19th century document. It's got a lot about democracy, a lot about justice, a lot about law. It has a lot about elections. It depicts elections that have gone awry. The results aren't acceptable. It depicts power struggles. It depicts, it has so many 19th century kinds of ideas in it that many people fault it and say, this isn't an ancient text. It's too full of, American principles that we recognize as Americans. And yet it is an ancient text. It is an ancient text. It just happens to be that these principles were established and lived out anciently on the same land. But again, think of Mosiah, think of the judges, the system of judges, the voice of the people. What a central principle in Nephite government until the time of the undoing of their particular form of government. Elections were held. Monarchy was discussed in the Book of Mosiah, and then the judges and the voice of the people, and this idea of everyone having their mind as to government, being able to vote according to their mind and their own understandings. That's depicted in the book. So it's an ancient text, but surprisingly, it's got so many relevant stories and relevant ideas for us to learn from and apply in our own lives, including the passage I read from Moroni, who's a 4th century writer, the last of the writers, and he's speaking directly to us about the decrees of God upon the land, and we are to serve the Lord, serve the God of the land. All right, let's get to the white horse prophecy. Now, the white horse prophecy is a prophecy that is, attributed to Joseph Smith, but has not been substantiated. This is the statement of the church. It has not been substantiated by historical documents and by those who are in a position to substantiate that. And it does not constitute church doctrine. Now, that being said, that does not mean that the white horse prophecy does not, in some sense, depend upon statements that may have been made by the prophet Joseph Smith in the company of those who were closest to him. We have several accounts of people who heard Joseph Smith say something along the lines of, the day will come when the Constitution of the United States will be hanging by a thread, or that it will be shredded and protected and preserved by either the Latter-day Saints or the elders of Israel, or a combination of that, or just good people everywhere who have goodwill towards law and order. Now, I bring that up because Elder McConkie, in his writing in the Mormon Doctrine, points out, and he's quoting Joseph F. Smith, so a great the 6th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in this dispensation. They flatly say the prophecy is not inspired, okay? But in saying that, which I also believe and accept, he does say the persons who were involved with the white horse prophecy to generate and to bring it forth, it appears to Joseph F. Smith that they simply they put together some broken sentences from the prophet that they may have heard him utter from time to time, and formulated this so-called revelation out of it. And it was never spoken by the prophet in the manner, notice the qualifying language, in the manner in which they have put it forth. Okay, so Joseph F. Smith's not saying that these statements, that these words, certain of these words didn't come from the prophet Joseph Smith. They may very well have, but he's saying that those who put together this prophecy are simply using, statements they may have heard from Joseph Smith to cobble together the prophecy. And the prophecy itself has not been substantiated, and Joseph F. Smith and, Elder McConkie, for that matter, both, and the church, we do not accept the prophecy as church doctrine. But I find these statements really interesting, that these people who are fabricating this prophecy, if indeed it is fabricated, and I believe it is, were using, though, statements or verbiage, phraseology that may very well be attributed, or may plausibly be attributable to the prophet Joseph Smith. And why do I say that? Well, because we have Brigham Young on one occasion teaching the same, at least one occasion teaching the same basic idea. We also have John Taylor, as Elder McConkie notes here. I believe it was, yes. So we have a John Taylor, we have a Brigham Young statement to that effect, and a John Taylor statement to that effect. And in this particular book, The Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, that I have, I wanted to read a few examples of the other statements we have on record. Now, these are not the white horse prophecy, but these are simply people who suggest that they heard the prophet Joseph Smith, or that they're aware of this particular teaching by the prophet Joseph Smith. And by the way, the prophet often spoke of the Constitution. He was a friend of the Constitution. He said on one occasion, "I am the greatest advocate in the world of the Constitution." Okay, so it's not at all implausible that he says such a thing. And by the way, it's also demonstrated by the history of the Book of Mormon that the people, they had a stable government ruled by law, and the voice of the people that ultimately, is shredded and hangs by a thread before the Lord comes in the book of 3rd Nephi. So it's consistent with the Book of Mormon stories as well. All right, so I'll give you just a few examples of this. Now, again, this is not the white horse prophecy, but this is some of the language that may have been used to cobble that together, and yet this person here is James Burgess. Okay, words of James Burgess. In the month of May 1843, we get this. This is kind of the context. He says that. He said that Joseph said, "And upon the Constitution and government of the United States," stating, he was speaking upon the Constitution and the government of the United States, stating that the time would come when the Constitution and government would hang by a brittle thread and would be ready to fall into other hands. But this people, the Latter-day Saints, will step forth and save it. I, James Burgess, he says, was present and testify to the above. And so we have pretty formal testimony here as to this teaching from the mouth of Joseph Smith, according to James Burgess. Now, I have another example here. Words of Brigham Young. Will the Constitution be destroyed, he asks? No, it will be held inviolate by this people. And as Joseph Smith said, Brigham Young said, the time will come when the destiny of the nation will hang upon a single thread. At that critical juncture, this people will step forth and save it from the threatened destruction. Okay, so that's Brigham Young. And now Orson Hyde, a quote from Orson Hyde. These are contemporaries with Joseph Smith. It is said, by the way, I find Orson Hyde's interesting because he's correcting the former statements and saying, I didn't hear it the same way, exactly what they're saying, but I heard it this other way, okay? So it is said that Brother Joseph in his lifetime declared that the elders of this church should step forth at a particular time when the Constitution should be in danger and rescue it and save it. This may be so, Orson Hyde says. This may be so. So it's plausible, he says. But I do not recollect that he said exactly so, that Joseph said it in this exact way. Instead, I believe he said something like this, that the time would come when the Constitution and the country would be in danger of an overthrow. And said he, if the Constitution be saved at all, if it be saved at all, it will be by the elders of this church. I believe this is about the language as nearly as I can recollect it. And that was Orson Hyde. This is recorded in the Journal of Discourses, of course. And there's some, and by the way, the previous one from Brigham Young is recorded in the Journal of Discourses, which there's some questions around the accuracy of the Journal of Discourses because it was recorded in shorthand, and so not everything is perfectly recorded in the Journal of Discourses. But these statements are very interesting. And then one more from Eliza R. Snow, or attributed to Eliza R. Snow in Deseret News Weekly in January of 1870. She said, I heard him, Joseph, say that the time would come when this nation would so far depart from its original purity, its glory, and its love for freedom and its protection of civil and religious rights, that the Constitution of our country would hang, as it were, by a thread. He said also that this people, the sons of Zion, would rise up and save the Constitution and bear it off triumphantly. So we have several statements that suggest that some of Joseph's loyal contemporaries like Brigham Young, Orson Hyde, Eliza R. Snow, and James Burgess heard Joseph Smith teach this principle. And in in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, this very thing is added to here by John Taylor, because John Taylor, according to the entry under the Constitution of the United States, under this entry, this scholar, Ralph Hancock, writes that LDS attachment to the Constitution has been further encouraged by an important oral tradition deriving from a statement attributed to Joseph Smith, according to which the Constitution would hang by a thread and be rescued, if at all. So he's quoting Orson Hyde's statement, only with the help of the saints. But then he adds this: Church President John Taylor seemed to go further than Joseph Smith when he prophesied, "When the people shall have torn to shreds the Constitution of the United States, the elders of Israel will be found holding it up to the nations of the earth and proclaiming liberty and equal rights to all men. To defend the principles of the Constitution under circumstances where the iniquity or moral decay of the people has torn it to shreds might well require wisdom at least equal to that of the men raised up to found it." Did you catch that? This is fascinating. It will require great wisdom, just like the founders had wisdom to devise the Constitution, and they were raised up to that purpose. There are others who will have to have sufficient or equivalent wisdom to defend and preserve the Constitution in their own day, because it will be torn to shreds and need to be defended and or upheld. In particular, he says it would require great insight into the relationship between freedom and virtue in a political embodiment of moral agency. So he talks about, again, it's the same sentiment. It's just John Taylor teaching it in different language. And so, because this white horse prophecy, is not accepted as doctrine, but there is certain language in the prophecy that seems to be attributable plausibly to Joseph Smith's teachings. And those statements, as I just read them to you, are consistent with Book of Mormon history, as I pointed out. Clearly, we have monarchy established, then we have a form of democracy or some form of some kind of hybrid government established under the judges, and then that unravels and becomes anarchical through secret combinations and other extreme elements, radicalization and so forth. And then we get the coming of the Lord, and the nation is basically hanging by a thread in the early part of 3rd Nephi. In fact, it's broken up into tribes, and essentially tribalisms ensued. And then the Lord comes and establishes an era of peace, which is akin to the millennial reign of his government. The government would be upon his shoulder, and he would reign, and he would establish his government. And by the way, it will not be exclusive to Latter-day Saints. It will be a broad government that involves and protects the rights of all people to worship whom they want to worship. It just so happens that the telestial, the most wicked, will have been burned up in the consummation decreed at his coming. But it will be a broad form of government under his kingship. So he will be a monarch. He will be the second David. He will come to reign on earth and establish righteous government upon his shoulder. But it will allow for diversity of thought even then, okay? So in other words, no one's compelled. Freedom of conscience is still the central principle. All of us have agency, and we should have freedom of conscience under any righteous government. And anybody who feels like, people want to establish one doctrine or one denomination over all others, that is just not righteous government. That is not of God. It never has been. It never will be until we all, until the day when we all subscribe to, in the case of, we'll be ruled by those laws we are willing to be ruled by, essentially. So when we consent to the celestial laws, then we will inherit the celestial kingdom. When we fully abide by those laws, we'll be prepared to enter into the celestial kingdom. And all those who are not fully on board and choose differently and act differently and want something other, they will receive something other than that, according to their desires, whatever whatever they've desired in righteousness, they will receive just that portion that they have desired. So these statements are very interesting. They're very consistent. They also seem to coincide well with the Book of Mormon history and recent current events. I would suggest that recently we've had we've averted constitutional crises recently. And, some sober and fair-minded individuals have helped us through this season, as we have heard from people who fortunately have a good sense of what it is that the Constitution offers us. And, we need to continue to promote free and fair elections, and these righteous principles should be sustained and defended and upheld by objective and fair-minded people who have the best interest of the country in mind, and not necessarily just their narrow tribal identities in mind. Hopefully we can have statesman-like individuals who are interested in justice and in fairness for all, who can help us through these difficult seasons. And by the way, we often talk about, that the scriptures talk about the kinds of people we ought to, seek out for office, but it's neglected to bring up verse 3 of section 134, where we learn that those who are civil officers in a constitutional republic like ours, this is section 134, it says, "We believe that all governments necessarily require civil officers and magistrates to enforce the laws of the same." So laws should be enforced. The Constitution allows for the making of law, but laws also need to be enforced by elected and appointed civil officers and magistrates to enforce the laws of the same, and that such as will administer the law in equity and justice should be sought for and upheld by the voice of the people. If a republic, or the will of the will of the sovereign, if not a republic. So notice the kinds of persons we are to seek as magistrates and civil officers are to be those who want to uphold justice and administer law in equity and in justice and in fairness. Okay? In other words, rule of law. Those who love the rule of law and who do not see themselves as a law unto themselves, or do not apply law partially or in a partisan kind of way. We want impartial leaders who execute and administer the law in righteousness and judgment and justice, and in proper understanding of these constitutional principles which were given us by God for the execution of the law, and for the carrying out of the law and its the making of law and its enforcement, so that we can enjoy unity and tranquility, domestic tranquility, and have life, liberty, and pursue happiness without obstacles, coming from those who are enemies to such righteous principles. Or when we should face enemies, may they be, brought to justice, and or, like Joseph said, those in leadership who take the oath of office need to defend the Constitution, or they need to suffer a penalty that's severe, because there's a lot at stake here for those who are in such offices. And so I subscribe to that. I hope that this has been interesting. I know that there's a lot here. I'll have other videos where we talk about related issues. I'm really interested in this, and I have several books coming in the mail today, and I want to get into other things that are relative to this, but this is enough for today. Thank you for your time, and have a good weekend.